not only about claiming that we are one humanity. It's much more than that. It's not merely about a claim of oneness. So it's not only a descriptive term, it's an evaluative term. It really comes with a challenging question. How do we keep on working together ethically and politically to realize our oneness, our unavoidable interdependence, especially as we envision the habitability of life on planet Earth? How will future generations evaluate us on this scorecard? I don't want to be sort of Pollyannish, but we cannot and should not eliminate our lived experiences of differences and even disagreements. And that is why when I hear the word oneness, it's much more than just a feel-good term for me. I hear a call to action, visionary action, and which, this work of trying to work towards oneness, finding common ground, and knowing that we are all equally going to be affected by whatever the outcome is, it really is a call to visionary action. So to summarize in a rather simple way, our roadmap for tonight, as I see it, the word spirit is an invitation to reflect about the what. The word oneness to reflect about the why. And climate justice to reflect about the how. Now, I'm sure our thoughtful panelists will have much more to offer us. Now, due to unforeseen circumstances, one of our panelists could not join us today, but we have 3 distinguished panelists here tonight. And this is going to be the program for tonight. We'll have Janet Gray starting off first, and then Sharon Walsh, and then Tony Snow, and they will introduce themselves. And then Henry Locke and Sheila Flood will actually then set up the breakout rooms. And then we'll have time to share and think about what we've taken from this session. And I think Sheila has already posted the questions we want you to sort of use as your guide, or sort of a guiding question during the breakout rooms. And then we'll have a Q&A. So please feel free during the entire webinar to post your comments, your questions in the chat box. We, as a group, will be collecting them. And if you have any specific panelists that you are asking a question to, please specify, and we'll hopefully get enough time to also, take up some of these questions. Perhaps we may not have time to take up all the questions. So with that, can I now pass it on to Janet Gray? Over to you, Janet.
Thank you, Farouk, and good evening to everyone. I'm going to share a screen. Is that good, Farouk? No?
Yes, looks fine.
Good. I am grateful to be here with you and to share a few thoughts about the climate crisis we all face, about the urgency I feel, and the call to action I hear for people of all faiths. I believe we live on holy, sacred ground, and that we are all part of the sacred, interconnected web of life. I will introduce myself as I speak of things that I care deeply about. The United Church of Canada has been my faith home most of my life, and through the United Church, I have been very active with both Kairos Canada, a faith-based ecumenical organization, and more recently with For Love of Creation, a national initiative launched on Earth Day 2020 to unify faith groups to mobilize for climate justice. I have been inspired and influenced by many things in my life, but the messages of love and justice that Jesus taught have helped form my core being, helped shape values of truthfulness, kindness, compassion, gratitude, and many more. I see in Jesus someone who was an activist, who shared his messages by telling stories that changed and moved people into action. They empowered people living under an oppressive empire to create a better world. And those stories still inspire. Jesus shared a vision with those that listened of a new way to live, of a kingdom where love, respect, and justice were the pillars of community. We all need to hear stories of and create visions of our future that are about compassion, respect, and living more simply. We need these stories to confront the more dominant ones that we hear. For example, the story of Canada. In light of the truth-telling and courageous testimonies we have heard in recent years from Indigenous people, our story of Canada has changed. Christians must acknowledge our part in a history of domination and genocide of Indigenous peoples, and our part in the domination and destruction of the natural world around us. We must meet these truths head on and take action. Much is expected from all of us. As someone who identifies as a Christian, I feel called to take seriously what it means to walk in a good way, and to learn about and support the implementation of the 94 calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I am grateful to the Sianu First Nation and the Lekwungen speaking people for the lessons I am learning about the camas, the Garry Oak, the Douglas fir, and about ways to support those calls to action. So when I talk about climate justice, I am also talking about respect for Indigenous rights. As I have learned over my life, it is important to think critically and act accordingly. We must be aware of our unvarnished history to understand how we arrived at this moment. And then we must do our best to apply these understandings to decide our actions. What are the structural systems of domination that brought us to the climate crisis? It didn't happen on its own. The facts are clear. We are dealing with human-induced temperature rise due to unsustainable carbon or greenhouse gas emissions. Christianity has been one of the key pillars in our Western European ways of thinking and acting that supported industrialization and colonization, and yes, the abuse of Mother Earth. As a Christian, I often have wondered just how we became so detached from the natural world around us that we have allowed such abuse of land, water, and people. This early 6th century mosaic that you see here portrays Jesus alive, standing in paradise, surrounded by plants, trees, birds, animals, and the celestial cosmos, part of creation. What happened to that early Christian relationship to nature and creation? This past November, I attended COP26 in Glasgow virtually from my home in Victoria, British Columbia. I was a United Church of Canada delegate along with Tony Snow, who you will hear from shortly. We were ourselves part of an 8-person ecumenical delegation from the United Church and from the For Love of Creation initiative. A total of some 40,000 people from around the world making it the largest gathering physically and virtually of all the climate change meetings since they began in Rio de Janeiro with the Earth Summit in 1992. 197 nation and member states were there. COP26 was expected to sort out the details of the 2015 Paris COP agreement. The goal of COP26 in Glasgow was to keep alive the hope of limiting human-caused global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. It was hoped that COP would establish goals and ambitions to cut emissions in half by 2030 and as close to zero as can be by 2050. This graph shows greenhouse gas emissions on the left and warming projections for Earth on the right under different scenarios. Different combinations of policies and actions by government and society as a whole. At present, 56 gigatons of carbon are emitted into the atmosphere each year. This is what is driving the temperature of the Earth's surface up. We are at 1.2 degrees Celsius now. The light green band at the bottom shows how emissions could drop and how temperature increases could be limited to a goal of 1.5 degrees Celsius if, and only if, immediate and strident policies are implemented. The blue band at the top shows where we are headed with existing policies and actions. Business as usual will deliver more than 2.5 degrees warming. These dire circumstances led the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change to sound a code red alarm for planet Earth this past summer. At COP26, there was a pact made to phase down, but not phase out, production of new coal sources. Fossil fuels were finally mentioned at this COP, but no significant talk of oil or agreements made to phase oil out. Or on the other hand, the financiers turned up in numbers at a COP for the first time. I think the insurance industry was there too. It may be that attitudes are shifting. But Paul Beckwith, a Canadian physicist and a climate system scientist, said, quote, "As long as there are more fossil fuel lobbyists on the inside at these meetings than there are governments, countries, and civil society, then the house or system is rigged, and it is not seriously dealing with the threat of climate change. In any event, promises alone cannot deliver. The reality is that without better targets and rigorous policy implementation, it looks like we are headed towards a 2.4 intolerable warming of the planet." There was a new sense of urgency at COP26 as compared to previous COP meetings, but outside the COP meetings, the urgency of our situation was much more palpable in the crowds, in the signs, in the conversations, and in the sessions hosted by youth, Indigenous leaders, NGOs, and faith groups. The moral argument for climate justice should be easily understood by most people who understand compassion. This is because the challenges faced by those people and communities most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, in many cases, have had the least to do with creating emissions. Forced relocation, displacement, and migration of millions of people due to climate change has already begun. Climate justice calls us into action to advocate for people and communities most affected, and to advocate for environmental integrity and sustainability. To successfully head towards a zero carbon economy, or better still, a net positive economy, all parts of our society must mobilize. Increasing temperatures will impact some of us more than others. We know in BC how yearly fires and now flooding has impacted people we may know. Many vulnerable nations were pleading for help at COP26. These nations asked for funding for adaptation and for losses and damages that they have already faced. Their messages were expressed clearly, but were they heard? Indigenous peoples are often the most vulnerable and the most directly impacted. Climate change is not a future event for them. They are living it every day, right now. People of faith hear what is being said and see what is not being said. A newly formed organization called Green Faith is supporting the formation of Green Faith circles worldwide. They are working on 3 pathways to empower change: personal transformation, institutional leadership, and systemic change. There are many ways in which people can take action. We all have choices. How then shall we live? Our grief for the loss of species, animal, plant, or humans from climate-related events is important to feel and to acknowledge. This grief has a potential to immobilize us and fill us with fear, or it can move us into action. My hope is that we will root ourselves in love for each other and for all of creation, that our communities of faith worldwide rise to the challenges before us to create communities that are grounded in justice and respect for each other and all beings, and take the path of action. Hope will be found in our actions. actions that we take together to stand up against the continuing injustices and abuse of the earth and her creatures. May it be so. Amen.
Thank you, Janet. Thank you for that very moving and eloquent presentation. And really, you know, as you were talking, two important questions I've taken away from your presentation. This question of how did we come to be so detached, which is another way of saying when did we stop caring? I love the fact that you talked about compassion and love. And when I think of caring, I think of that central word that is there in the Bible, caritas, right? It can be translated as care or love. But I mean, it's either a question of us not actually seeing or believing what is actually happening and that we can somehow switch off. But thanks again for that wonderful reminder, and wonderful to hear that you were able to be at COP26. And I hope you will continue to contribute in your own way. I'm sure there'll be a lot more such global events in the future. Well, thank you very much. And I'll now pass it on to Sharon Welch. Over to you, Sharon.
Great. Thank you, and good evening, everybody. And as Farouk said, my name is Sharon Welch, and I want to start off tonight by saying a big thank you to VMS for the organizing of this event and for all the people who are participating. It's such an important topic, and it's wonderful that you're taking the time to organize these kinds of events. So thank you. And thank you, Janet, for your wise words. I really appreciated what you had to share. I'm a member of the Baha'i community, and I live in Langford, where I'm grateful to share the ancestral lands of the Kosapsan and Luangans people. I was asked to speak today on the global efforts on the environment and to share a little about the Baha'i perspective on the environment and on global governance, because that's a really key principle in teaching within the Baha'i faith. And another concept that's really important in the faith that all of these other ones are embedded into when you look at global issues of poverty, peace, and the environment is the maturation of humanity. And the writings teach that just as we as individuals grow and mature through various stages from infancy to childhood, adolescence to adulthood, so too does the world of humanity evolve and change and goes through different stages of gradual civilization and social organization. And that currently we are taught that we are moving towards a stage of maturity as a humanity. And the evidence of this maturity will be the growing recognition of the oneness of humanity, that we are one human family sharing one common earth, the recognition of the unity of all of creation, and the establishment of just global institutions as a way of bringing the peoples of the earth together to solve our challenges. In the Baha'i teachings, unity is also seen as something that permeates all of existence and is a universal law of nature. A good example of this unity is the human body. And when you look at all the different components, we have hearts and lungs and blood and toes and eyes and ears, and yet they all work together, even though they're very diverse. They are all able to work together for the health and well-being of the body. And that the Baha'i teach that unity is seen as something that permeates all of existence. And this interconnectedness, or this unity and diversity within the world of creation, actually reveals that the base or foundation of the sustainability of life is mutual aid and helpfulness. And I always find that really profound when you think about it, that unity that we do is actually an evidence in all of nature of mutual aid and helpfulness as a fundamental principle of life. And so you can see that evident in the example of the body and in so many things in nature. When you look around, it's evident in so many places. And Baha'u'llah stated that the well-being of mankind, its peace and security are unattainable unless and until its unity is firmly established. And Shoghi Effendi, who was the guardian of the Baha'i faith in the mid-20th century, explained that the world is becoming more and more integrated, and that the unity amongst its people will gradually be established and a consciousness of world citizenship will evolve. And this emerging consciousness, this sort of maturity of humanity, I think can be seen in the rejection of deeply ingrained racial prejudices, in our increased concern for the environment, in the concern for human rights, in the pursuit of universal education, in the establishment of interfaith activities like the one we're part of tonight, and in the hundreds of thousands of local, national, international organizations engaged in some form of social action, working to make a better world. And with the view of unity as an expression of cooperation and mutual assistance being the base and the foundation of all of life, you can see how from the Baha'i perspective, our focus is on how we can work together at all levels, including globally. And currently, the main international institution created to ensure our peace and security is the United Nations. And since its formation in 1945, the UN has been a key player in bringing nation states together and trying to create global cooperation and global governances. Unfortunately, due to some flaws that were inherited from the very start of the United Nations, it has really been hampered in its ability to deal with some of the critical issues we face. The General Assembly of the United Nations has absolutely no clout. They can make treaties and declarations, but there's no ability to enforce those. The veto power within the Security Council means it's often unable to respond to critical issues. And the UN is also seen as non-democratic, both because of the Security Council, which places the majority of the power in decision-making in the hands of a few nations, and also because of the one country, one vote. Currently, we have a situation where the small island of Tuvalu in the South Pacific, which is a nation state of the UN, has 11,900 people, and it has the same vote as China with almost 1.5 billion. And the world has changed a lot since 1945 and more integrated, and it's more and more complex. There are so many more players. There's now intergovernmental organizations, international market forces, civil society, and transnational challenges that need to be managed, sharing of our waters, rivers that run through many different countries, oceans that we share, migratory animals, cross-border pollutants, and so many more complex issues. And many nation states are unable to solve the problems they face on their own. And this is causing them to recognize the need to cooperate in creating international systems of governance. But the reality is that currently there is no global organization with the authority to effectively manage the changes and organize the diverse international players. Consequently, the world faces many global challenges, and the environment being just one. Having said that, I think it's really important to note that despite the challenges the UN has faced, it has done a tremendous amount for and is very dedicated to addressing the issues of our time, including the environment. Within the UN, there are numerous agencies addressing environmental issues. The United Nations Environmental Program, or the UNEP, it started in 1972 at the Stockholm Conference, which was the first United Nations Conference on the Environment. And it is a global authority that sets the environmental agenda. They describe themselves as an authoritative advocate. And so that to me sort of sums up what the issue is. They really can only advocate, but they're an authoritative advocate. They oversee many environmental issues from air, water, biosafety, forestries, transport, resources, technology. They even have an area where they address youth education and the environment. And of course, there are the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and many of these address issues around the environment. A major focus of the work of the UN, and I think probably one of the most important focuses, is the bringing together of diverse groups, scientists, politicians, youth, faith communities, NGOs, industries, business, and trying to work together to create cooperative responses And the interactions between the UNEP and civil society has grown significantly in the past decade. There's now over 500 NGOs that have formal consultative relationships with or status with the US. There's also a program under the environmental program, which is called the Environmental Assembly, and it's the world's highest level decision-making body on the environment. And it's working towards creating a coherent system of international environmental governances. And beyond just the work of the UN, there are many people the world over that are recognizing the critical and obvious need for a coherent international strategy for action on the environment that is enforceable. And there are efforts on many levels to address this need. A really good example, I'm going to share with you 3 different examples, but a really good one is the Environmental Pact. And Sheila's going to be sending out a handout to everyone. And so there will be more information on the link to that. But it is a coalition bringing together NGOs, activists, artists, citizens, lawyers, scientists, and just the average person to address the need and advocate for a global environmental framework that better protects our planet and addresses the current gaps in international law. They have created a draft international text that aims to ensure a new generation of fundamental rights related to the protection of the environment, and in particular, to the right to a healthy environment. They state that our laws aren't doing enough to tackle the environmental crisis, and the Pact's purpose is to unify international law that is currently fragmented. So there's many different international laws around the environment, but they're all in little bits and pieces, and they're trying to create a coherent international framework in which they all fit. And unlike the existing agreements that only focus on specific subjects, the Pact aims to be the first international treaty to address the matter of the environment as a whole. Yep. Am I running out of time?
Just if you can bring it to a close so that we can.
Yeah, I just got a couple more examples. And I was just going to talk a little bit about the success of the ozone layer. And that was a great example of many, many different nations and peoples coming together and having a very, very successful outcome. And also the coalition for the UN We Need. And that is a civil society partnership. And it came out of the 75th anniversary of the United Nations with an opportunity to take stock of and to strengthen the UN system and partnerships with civil society, the government, and the UN. And again, that will be in your handout, so I encourage you to take a look at it. And when one of the things they say on their site, on the Coalition for the UN We Need, is that we need bold collective action now more than ever. And that is the thought that I want to leave you with regarding the global environment, is that we need bold collective action now more than ever to create unity through mutual support and cooperation amongst the peoples of the world as a base or foundation for our well-being. So thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. Wow, one often gets very sort of pessimistic when we talk about not only the climate crisis, but the governance crisis because of the polarizations in our political sort of world. But when you talk about all these amazing NGOs and so much work that is already getting done, but never gets to our attention, I mean, this is something I think it's so heartening to hear that. But it is interesting. It begs the question that why is it that something about our institutional processes are not as effective as they could be, and somehow why is it that those who really are keen on just upsetting things and, in a sense, turning things around are more effective? Well, I mean, these are big questions. Hopefully we can take them up in the groups. But yeah, a very important reminder that really institutions themselves are not outside of us. We are the institutions. So thank you very much, Sharon. And if I can now pass it on to Tony Snow. Tony, over to you.
Yes, thank you. My name is Tony Snow. I come from the Stoney Nakoda First Nation west of Calgary, Alberta, and I am joining you here from our traditional lands, lands that we call Yetkamakoche, which means stony country, and it is our interpretation of earth. And so when we talk about land, we always do ceremony in relation to that. We offer a smudge, we offer a purification, that we might say the right things and that we might think good thoughts when we think about the creator and the gift of land that we have. And so we often say a short prayer, and I'll say that now. Jesus Christ, Amen. Thank you. Oftentimes in our history, those ceremonies were prohibited, and we were not allowed to express our deeply held beliefs. And so when we come to situations like this, especially with our interfaith neighbors, often we only hear the colonial side of the story. And in our traditional way, we remember that our ancestors were welcoming to the newcomers, were welcoming to the explorers, welcoming to the missionaries. In our particular tradition, we adopted Christianity after an Anishinaabe missionary came to our community and began to share and began to demystify the Bible for us and align that with our own beliefs. So we live in a balance between Christianity and our indigenous Sioux heritage. And so just a note about myself, but in this balancing in my upbringing, there's always been an awareness that our traditional ways must be held in balance with the ways of the newcomer and how we welcome that information, but we also learn from it and we move forward. At the time we talk today, we are gathered because we are children of creation, as people of this planet, aware that our way of life has become unsustainable. Our exploitation and patterns of consumption are having a detrimental effect on our ecosystems and the regeneration of habitats, or the viability of species. And so this becomes a problem for the larger community to start working through. This has long been known by Indigenous people, that the systems we engage to make the ecosystem work for us, our stewardship, is forcing us to work beyond our limits, oftentimes because as Indigenous people, we are stewards of the land, but we are also stewards of that diversity within creation that is 80% of the world's diversity. And so as we look to some of the effects that are happening for the polar bears in the north, or for even in the BC area, the dried out and parched soils that are washed away when an atmospheric river hits, so that there's consequence of flooding and mass chaos in our environments. Those are consequences that are interconnected and linked. And so when we talk about Indigenous spirituality, Indigenous ways of understanding, it's all based on the idea of interconnection. And there's a cost to our activity. And we live with those consequences every day as the land suffers. My father wrote a book called These Mountains Are Sacred Places. And I'll just read a quote from there. It says, through our language, we learn about legends, our religion, our oral history, and our belief systems. It is an Indigenous, beautiful history to tell others so that they too will journey with us according to what ways that we see the world from a Native perspective. We interpret this history to mean that we are among the Creator's sacred creations, that our people are related to other beings in creation, and we share the feeling of sacredness with them. Our surroundings come alive. The history of our legends are told by the living words of our elders. Our history is recorded in our experiences in relationship to the earth, sun, moon, stars, the elements, the seasons, the winds, the waters, the fire, and weather, because they're all connected to each other, to us, through our oral history. The elders know and talk about other forms of life, sentient beings and sacred beings that dwell amongst us and journey with us in our human and spiritual travels in life. And so it is this point of Indigenous spirituality and how we intersect with things like science, things like government policy, and how in our offerings, those are often viewed in a insubstantial way, a lack of understanding. When the environmental assessments come to our elders, the young people who are interviewing these elders for the information that they hold, there's not a lot of context for them in their life. And so there's a misinterpretation that goes out that further hampers what the cross-cultural communication is trying to tell us. And often what is important in that gets lost. And so our voices are minimized by scientism that demands quantification over generations of oral testimony. Not too long ago, this was also a matter for the courts, which after Delgamuukw gave credence to elders' words. But implementing a court decision in policy and legislation takes generations, time that we do not have. And so we continue to wait, seeing incremental solutions implemented while the chaos grows ever out of control. As a member of the delegation to COP25 and to COP26, I saw firsthand how the interests of Indigenous people were systematically excluded, while institutional voices, often from industry, continued to work toward industry interests at the expense of habitats, ecosystems that continue to suffer from global impacts. As we move now toward this talk of adaptation, we should be mindful that this is not resolving an overall issue. It is forestalling an immediate disaster as we press forward with extractivist and exploitive agendas that continue the devastation. Adaptation is another form of incrementalism. It does not change models. It tweaks the system to support the status quo. It is difficult to know that some of our most sensitive areas, areas of knowledge and wisdom, are being eroded each day, sometimes with the added insult of Indigenous lives heaped upon the carnage. In the faith-based community, there have been several efforts from different denominations and different groups, and a lot of them seek to work with Indigenous people, and a lot of them ineffectively work through that because there is no established relationship and there is no ongoing relationship and understanding of what the Indigenous people are saying to these groups and how they can utilize that in an effective effort to bring to the table these views so that they can be worked through. It is hard for a non-Indigenous person to be advocating through an Indigenous lens, and so that becomes problematic. So in the work that we do here at this gathering and others, I'm very impressed that there is a continual effort to address the climate crisis and how important that has been for many of our communities, and that we start to do that. We start to advocate in ways that are very supportive through these structures of morality and of trust that are built from the faith community. Very important for the, when I went to COP25, that the Secretariat called in all the faith members and all the people from different parts of the world to come and speak from the faith perspective on what we were advocating and why we were interested in this environmental message. And so that created, I think, more of a groundswell and hope for the people that were dealing with this from a faith perspective. We gathered, we talked every day, we worked through these things, and to be offered that space to work through some of these complicated issues from the perspective that we are also a moderating voice and a help if we are dutifully included. And that's the same message for Indigenous people. We really need to have that inclusion, that place to the table in order to speak and work through what we need to do to build better relationships. So I thank you for inviting me, and thank you for this time to be able to share with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tony. That really, you've left such rich food for thought here, What I'm really taking away from your presentation, earlier I said we're not only spiritual creatures, we're not only natural creatures, but what you reminded us that we are storytelling creatures. And it seems that we have lost the narratives that can inspire us today. And the narratives that shape consumerism, incrementalism, and extraction, they just really are quite empty, and yet we somehow give them more meaning than that's due. And maybe this is it, how we recover more inspiring narratives, which are at the heart of what it also means to be religious or spiritual. I know the term narrative can be talked about as myth, but we really are in need of these inspiring myths that help us see ourselves in the stories, that we are telling, and thus we care about the stories that we want to tell. But also that in the process of telling these stories, as you did so eloquently when you quoted your father's words, we shift, we change in the process of telling these stories about who we are in the natural world and or who we are ultimately. So thank you very much. And really, there's been such an interesting mix and rich ideas. I'll now pass it on to Henry and Sheila to hopefully set us up for the breakout rooms now. But clearly, you know, what I'm taking away from tonight's very, very engaging sense of sharing is that we can come together despite our, you know, different inheritances in terms of faith and culture. You know, and we often talk about this ideal that, okay, maybe different faith traditions are like different paths up the same mountain, or our differences are really formal in nature, that somehow at the level of essence, we share much more than what divides us. And we need, I think, to somehow have these sort of fora where this becomes real, where we have this sharing, and that we're not even apologetic about our faith commitments, and when we feel that our faith commitments have something to offer to these issues of political import and public life. You know, I often think that perhaps it came out several places, and I think John and Tony, you talked about it, you know, this idea of the aesthetic, or rather, you know, even of beauty, that's one thing that moves us easily. So there's that famous phrase by this Russian poet that aesthetics is the mother of ethics. But somehow, how do we, in a sense, radiate the beautiful and in a sense, in a way, you know, to in a way showcase what is going to be lost, the beauty that is going to be lost? I don't know, just a thought, and that perhaps is sometimes a very strong motivator for what gives us pleasure, but also what inspires us, just as an artist. And if we are artists of our own lives, what motivates us to be creative? And speaking on that, I wanted to share one small, you know, I think it was Linda who talked about cross-cultural encounters and what happens. And I often say that I learn more about my faith when I am in the presence of other faith traditions. It's almost like you learn the grammar of your language best when you're learning a second language, because you're never conscious about the grammar of your own language. And when I'm in contact with other faith traditions, my own faith deepens. And when I first arrived in Victoria about 24, 25 years ago, I got introduced to the poet P.K. Page. Some of you may know her, Patricia Kathleen Page. And it was amazing, a strong relationship developed. I ended up editing some of her short stories. I had the honor of doing that. But I remember talking to her and sharing with her something from my own tradition, that with the way we think about sacredness in creation, there's several verses in the Quran that refer to the signs of God, the ayats of Allah, and that really the universe is a text filled with these signs of sacredness. And all we need to do is read those signs of sacredness. And she was so moved in her own inimitable way, because she was a mystic of sorts. And when I next met her, she wrote this small poem. Henry, can you put up that poem if you can? And it's called Stargazer. And it reads so here, think about the universe as a text. The very stars are justified, the galaxy italicized. I have proofread and proofread the beautiful script. There are no errors. And I can't tell you how emotional I got that I shared something from my tradition, and this incredibly gifted poet came up with these 8 lines. I don't know if they move you, but you know, this idea of, you know, of the margins, the page, right? The stars are justified, the galaxy are italicized. And yeah, there is in a sense the perfection out there that we need to perhaps be moved by. Thanks, Henry. Well, I suppose it leaves me to bring good things to an end. Unfortunately, good things do have to come to an end, but then there are new beginnings. And I hope that some of us will meet again and continue this conversation. But I would like to basically thank especially Sheila Flood, who's really been the inspiration behind this event and got all of us mobilized. So thank you, Sheila, and she's with the Victoria Multi-Faith Society for your constant energy and your amazing generosity in how you create these moments. And I particularly would like to thank Henry Locke for keeping us on track in our meetings and telling us, look, this is not going to be some historical, earth-shattering webinar that's going to change the world. Just it's a time to share. But thank you again for managing all the logistics. Well, all I can say is stay safe, be in peace, and yeah, I mean, let 1,000 flowers bloom. That's Chairman Mao. But anyway, let's see what change awaits us. Thank you to our panelists. I mean, I was remiss in not thanking our panelists, but Janet, Sharon, and Tony, thank you for sharing your wisdom. As you can see, you generated so much rich insight and discussion. So thank you to the panelists once again.